The fishing boat cut through the gray Alaskan water at dawn, and nobody on board had any reason to believe that day would be different from any other. They were miles off course, fuel running low, and the GPS showed nothing but open ocean ahead. But there was an island right in front of them, solid, real, covered in dense vegetation, and it wasn't on any chart they carried. What they found when they stepped ashore would eventually reach the desks of federal agencies, archaeologists, and national news editors across the country. Information from internet sources, links in description. Subscribe, let's begin. Alaska is one of the last places on Earth where the map still lies to you. The state contains more coastline than the entire continental United States combined, over 33,000 miles of it. And that number alone should tell you something about how much of it has never been properly documented. Think about it. If you stretched Alaska's coastline in a straight line, you could wrap it around the equator and still have thousands of miles left over. In waters that cold, that remote, and that dangerous, entire geographic features have slipped through the cracks of official record-keeping for centuries. The crew aboard the vessel was a small commercial fishing operation out of Kodiak Island, one of the roughest and most storied fishing hubs in North America. There were 5 men total, the captain, 2 deckhands, and 2 seasonal workers who had signed on for the halibut run that year. They were working the waters of the Gulf of Alaska, somewhere in the labyrinth of inlets, bays, and unnamed channels that define the southwestern coast. A mechanical issue with the navigation system had sent them drifting slightly off their planned route, and by the time they corrected course, visibility had dropped to almost nothing in a classic Alaskan fog bank. You have to understand what Alaskan fog actually means out there, because it's not the gentle mist you might picture rolling through a harbor. It's a wall. It presses against you like a physical object, erases the horizon completely, and makes the ocean feel like it goes on forever in every direction. Imagine standing in the middle of the ocean with zero visibility, your instruments giving you questionable readings, and your fuel gauge dipping toward the red. That's where these 5 men were when the island materialized out of the fog directly in front of them. The captain, a veteran of more than 20 years on Alaskan waters, later said he nearly drove straight into it. The island appeared suddenly, maybe 200 meters off the bow, a dark mass of spruce trees and rocky beach rising out of the water like something that had no business being there. He cut the engine, brought the boat around, and the crew stood in silence for a long moment, just staring at it. Nobody said anything right away. They simply looked at this landmass that their charts insisted did not exist. It was not a large island by any dramatic measure. Estimates would later put it at roughly the size of 40 or 50 city blocks, somewhere between 300 and 400 acres of land. Think about that in terms you can feel. It was smaller than New York's Central Park, yet somehow it had avoided formal documentation in a state that has been charted by the United States Geological Survey for well over 100 years. The crew made the decision to approach carefully and anchor in a shallow cove on the island's eastern side, where the water calmed and the beach offered a relatively safe landing. What they expected to find, if they expected anything at all, was a typical uninhabited Alaskan island. Rocky shores, spruce forest, maybe some seabird colonies, perhaps a few sea otters floating in the kelp offshore. Alaska has hundreds of islands exactly like that, places with no human footprint whatsoever, places where a brown bear might be the only resident for miles in every direction. The crew was cautious as they came ashore for exactly that reason. Brown bears in this region are not a creature you walk up on by surprise without consequences. But the bears were not what made them stop in their tracks the moment they cleared the tree line at the top of the beach. Imagine pushing through coastal vegetation, branches snapping under your boots, salt water still dripping from your rain gear, and then stepping into a clearing and finding something completely out of place in a wilderness that was supposed to have no human history. The first thing they saw were the structures. Low, partially collapsed but unmistakably deliberate walls made of stacked stone, and what appeared to be driftwood logs, arranged in a pattern that no storm or natural process could have created. There were at least 6 separate structures visible in that first clearing alone, and as the crew moved carefully through the area, more appeared deeper in the tree line. Some were little more than outlines in the earth, depressions where floors had been, rings of stones that once held walls upright. but others were surprisingly intact, roofless but standing, with corners that were still square, and walls that still reached waist height after what appeared to be a very long time of sitting in the Alaskan rain and frost. The captain immediately told everyone not to touch anything, which is the kind of instinct that separates experienced outdoorsmen from people who destroy history by accident. Here is where it starts to get complicated in ways that nobody on that boat was prepared for. Alaska's indigenous history is staggeringly deep and complex, and the Aleutian and Kodiak Island regions in particular carry layers of human habitation going back thousands of years. The Alutiiq people, also known as the Sugpiaq, built sophisticated communities throughout these waters long before any European ever pointed a ship toward the North Pacific. Their villages, their storage structures, their semi-subterranean homes called barabaras. These are precisely the kinds of structures that can survive in fragmented form for centuries under the right conditions. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it would mean to stumble onto a site that could potentially be hundreds of years old, or possibly much older, and to be the first modern people to lay eyes on it. That weight is not abstract. It's a responsibility that settles onto you whether you're ready for it or not. And these 5 fishermen were standing in the middle of it, with nothing but their rain gear and their satellite phone. The captain made a call that would define what happened next. Instead of keeping quiet about the find, which, if we're being honest with each other, some people in that situation might have chosen to do, he contacted the Coast Guard and reported the island's approximate coordinates and what his crew had discovered. That call set off a chain reaction that would take weeks to fully play out, drawing in the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office, researchers from the University of Alaska, and eventually a team of archaeologists who would charter their own vessel to reach the site. But before any of that happened, before the officials and the academics and the journalists began making phone calls and filing paperwork, the crew spent several more hours on that island, and what they found in those hours is the part of this story that the headlines only touched on, the part that raises questions nobody has fully answered even to this day. Because among the stone structures and the collapsed walls and the depressions in the earth, there were objects that should not have been there at all. Not in a place that was supposedly beyond the reach of any established trade network. Not on an island that didn't officially exist. One of the deckhands, a young man from Juneau on his second season working the halibut run, later described picking up a fragment of what appeared to be ceramic material from the forest floor near the largest structure on the site. He set it back down carefully, as the captain had instructed, but he described it in detail, curved, clearly manufactured, with a pattern along one edge that looked almost geometric in its precision. Ceramic production of that type was not something associated with traditional Alutiiq material culture in this particular region, and that small detail planted the first seed of what would become a much larger and more unsettling question. The fog had lifted by mid-afternoon, and the crew could now see the island more clearly from the water as they prepared to leave. From offshore, it looked almost perfectly unremarkable, just trees and rock and the gray Alaskan sky above it. The kind of scenery you pass without a second glance 100 times on any serious voyage through these waters. That ordinariness was perhaps the most disorienting thing about it. Something that looked like nothing had been hiding something that changed everything, sitting in the middle of the ocean for longer than anyone could yet say, waiting for a fishing boat to run slightly off course on the wrong kind of morning. And then the archaeologists arrived, and the real story began to surface. The first archaeological team reached the island approximately 3 weeks after the fishing crew's initial report, arriving on a clear morning in late summer when the Gulf of Alaska was about as forgiving as it ever gets. There were 4 of them, a lead archaeologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, 2 graduate students, and a cultural liaison from the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak, who would prove to be the most essential person on the entire expedition. They carried enough equipment for a 10-day preliminary survey, which in archaeological terms means you're not there to dig, you're there to look, to measure, to photograph, and to decide whether the site deserves the full weight of a proper excavation. What they found on that first day confirmed and then significantly exceeded what the fishing crew had reported. The site was larger than the initial estimate suggested, closer to 2 full acres of structured human activity, concentrated in the interior of the island, sheltered from the coastal wind by a natural ridge of spruce and alder that had probably been part of why this location was chosen in the first place. Whoever built here knew exactly what they were doing. They had selected a position that offered fresh water from a small stream, natural windbreak from the prevailing direction of the worst storms, clear sightlines to the water on three sides, and soil conditions that, while thin, were workable enough to support semi-permanent construction. You have to stop and appreciate the sophistication of that decision for a moment. Think about choosing a building site without any modern tools, without satellite imagery, without engineering software, just direct knowledge of the land, the weather, the tides, and the seasons. The people who picked this spot were not wandering randomly through the wilderness and setting up camp by accident. They were making calculated, experienced choices about how to live in one of the most demanding environments on the planet, and they were getting those choices exactly right. The ceramic fragment that the deckhand had noticed and carefully replaced was located, documented, and collected within the first 2 hours of the archaeological survey. When the lead archaeologist examined it in the field, her reaction was measured in the way that trained scientists keep their reactions measured. But the cultural liaison from the Alutiiq Museum was less reserved. He held the fragment carefully in his gloved hand and said, according to accounts later published in regional reporting on the discovery, that it reminded him of materials he had seen associated with trade goods from a completely different part of the Pacific, not local in origin, not Alutiiq in its manufacture, and not something that fit neatly into the established picture of who was moving through these waters and when. Trade networks in the ancient North Pacific were far more extensive than most people realize, and far more extensive than the history textbooks that most of us grew up with ever bothered to explain. Imagine a web of exchange routes stretching from the Aleutian Islands down through the Pacific Northwest coast, branching inland along river systems, connecting communities that spoke dozens of different languages across thousands of miles of some of the most formidable terrain on Earth. Obsidian from volcanic sources in what is now Oregon has been found at archaeological sites in Alaska. Copper from interior regions moved to coastal communities and then continued moving, hand to hand, across distances that seem impossible until you realize that indigenous peoples had been perfecting these networks for thousands of years before any European arrived to write about them. The ceramic material found on this island potentially pointed to something even farther reaching than the established regional trade picture. And that is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to pin down, because the preliminary field analysis could only say so much without laboratory testing. Samples were collected and sent to facilities capable of doing compositional analysis, the kind of work that can identify the geological signature of the clay and tell you, with a reasonable degree of certainty, where on Earth that material originated. Those results would take months to come back, and by the time they did, the initial headlines had already faded, and the public had largely moved on. But here is what those results eventually suggested, according to sources that covered the findings in regional Alaskan press and archaeological newsletters. The ceramic composition did not match any known local source. The closest geological match in the analysis pointed toward clay deposits found significantly farther west in a direction that, if you follow it long enough across the Pacific, eventually stops being Alaska at all. Nobody was prepared to make a dramatic claim based on a single fragment recovered from an undated surface context, and the archaeologists were appropriately careful about what conclusions they drew publicly. But the fragment was real, the analysis was real, and the question it raised was real. Think about what it would mean if that fragment represented genuine contact, direct or indirect, between this tiny unmapped island in the Gulf of Alaska and a trading network that extended across the North Pacific in a way that current historical models do not fully account for. Think about the generations of voyages, the accumulated knowledge of ocean navigation, the exchange of goods and ideas that would have had to exist for a piece of ceramic to travel that far and end up buried under Alaskan spruce needles on an island that didn't make it onto the modern charts. The structures themselves, once properly measured and documented, presented their own layer of complexity. The largest building on the site, the one the crew had initially identified from the clearing, measured approximately 9 meters on its longest interior wall, which placed it well within the size range of a communal structure rather than a simple family dwelling. Its construction showed evidence of at least 2 distinct phases of building activity, meaning the site had been used, modified, and rebuilt over a period of time, rather than occupied briefly and abandoned. One wall had been partially dismantled and then reconstructed at a slightly different angle, a detail that suggested not just habitation, but ongoing investment. People returning to this place, maintaining it, improving it across what could have been multiple generations. Radiocarbon dating samples were collected from charred organic material found at the base of one of the intact wall sections, the remains of what appeared to be a wooden structural element that had burned at some point during the site's occupation. Dating results placed the material somewhere between 400 and 600 years old, putting the occupation of this site somewhere in the range of the 15th or 16th century. That timeline sits precisely at one of the most contested and debated periods in North Pacific history, the era just before and during the earliest European contact with the region, when indigenous trade networks were at or near their maximum historical complexity and reach. The Alutiiq cultural liaison, in an interview conducted after the preliminary survey was completed, made a point that reframed the entire story in a way that the headlines mostly missed. He noted that the absence of this island from modern charts did not mean it was unknown. It meant it was unknown to the systems that produced those charts. The people whose ancestors built those stone walls almost certainly knew exactly where this island was, had names for it, had stories about it, and had been navigating to it and from it with precision for as long as the structures had stood. The island was not lost. It had simply never been entered into a particular set of records, and those records had come to define what counted as real and known. That observation carries a weight that extends far beyond this one island in the Gulf of Alaska. It points to something fundamental about how we understand exploration, discovery, and the limits of official knowledge in places where human history runs deeper than the documents we've preserved. The fishing crew didn't find something that had been waiting to be discovered. They found something that had been known, then forgotten by one world, while perhaps remaining known in other ways to another. The island was formally reported to federal and state authorities, added to geographic records, and flagged for future archaeological study. A full excavation has not yet been conducted, pending funding, permitting, and coordination with indigenous cultural stakeholders who have a legitimate and primary interest in whatever that site ultimately reveals. The 5 men who stumbled onto it on a foggy morning with a broken GPS have largely returned to the rhythms of their working lives on the water. But the island is still there, sitting in the Gulf of Alaska with its stone walls and its unanswered questions, waiting. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.